The London Underground is a much older system than we often give it credit for. As Peter Ackroyd points out, it's actually old enough that it's congruent with figures we consider historical, like Jack the Ripper. And given it's such an old system burrowing through the very clay on which London stands, it's hardly surprising that plenty of folklore and ghost stories lurk in its tunnels. Never mind the old phrase, mind the gap, perhaps we should be more worried about what's in the gap. Well, let's go and find out, shall we, in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you're well and I do hope that November is treating you well as well. I'm quite surprised that we're actually almost at the end of this year, but never mind. It's also hard to believe that Fabulous Folklore will actually be 3 in January, so we will do some kind of celebration for that as well. Now, we are just going to dive right into this week's episode because it's got quite a lot in it, because we are looking at the London Underground and there are going to be plenty of ghost stories and things like that I haven't been able to include for matters of space, because when you go looking for urban legends to do with the tube or just folklore to do with the tube in general, there's loads to choose from, so you have to try and narrow it down somehow. So that is what I've tried to do here. Because let's be honest, as I said in the introduction, the London Underground is a much older system than we often give it credit for. And as Peter Ackroyd points out, it is old enough that it's congruent with figures we consider historical, like Jack the Ripper. Peter Ackroyd does also point out in his book as well, and I quote, "The system itself was built before the unification of Italy and before the creation of Germany," end quote, which I just think really does say a lot about how old the system actually is. And yes, it does burrow through the very clay on which London stands, so you do obviously have this accumulation of history down in those tunnels, and indeed drivers have actually reported seeing shadowy figures moving in the unused tube stations as they pass. There are other kinds of legends associated with the tube, because some people claim that Boudica's final resting place lies beneath platform 10 at King's Cross Station. The ghost of Victorian actor William Terrace apparently patrols the platforms at Covent Garden Station, and sightings were weirdly common in 1955. There's even an urban legend that the Elephant and Castle shopping centre is a cover for a secret underground bunker in the area, and this bunker apparently occupies disused underground tunnels for an extension that never happened. And how about the ongoing legend that resurfaces periodically about a group of mutated Londoners who live on the network? According to the legend, they first moved into the tunnels in the late 19th century and have continued to live down there by feasting on discarded food and the occasional lone commuter. This legend even formed the basis of the 1972 horror film Deathline. So, like I said at the beginning, never mind the old phrase, mind the gap, perhaps we should be more worried about what's in the gap. Now, we are going to start off with Egyptian ghosts because the tale of the Egyptian princess at the British Museum station is perhaps my favourite piece of underground folklore. And the station once stood between Tottenham Court Road to the west and Holborn to the east on the Central Line. And there was a rumour that a tunnel connected the station to the Egyptian room at the British Museum. The ghost of an Egyptian princess whose mummy was in the museum would head down the secret tunnel to the station, and she apparently screamed in the tunnels. There are some rumours of sightings as well where she would apparently come down the platforms, but they're quite difficult to verify. But in the early 1930s, newspapers offered a reward to anyone who would spend the night in the British Museum station. Weirdly enough, no one volunteered, and the station closed on the 25th of September 1933 because it just wasn't really very popular, because people used the stations to either side which had connections to other lines. But the story gets stranger, because 2 women apparently disappeared from Holborn Station in 1935, although I couldn't find any mention of this in the British newspaper archives, because according to the legend, marks are found on the walls of the British Museum station soon after. That said, I did find one fascinating snippet regarding the mummy ghost of the British Museum, and I am saying ghost in inverted commas there. And this comes from the Market Harborough Advertiser and Midland Mail from 1932, and I quote, "It was never a real ghost and could be seen only in daylight. In some way, one of the mummies in a glass case was so placed that it caught the light at an odd angle. The result was that by standing at a certain point in the gallery, there was the illusion of a mummified ghost erect," end quote. So essentially you've got a weird form of Pepper's ghost actually in the museum, which led some people to think that there must be a mummy ghost. So it does make me wonder how much this optical illusion actually then inspired tales of ghosts down in the tube station as well. Now I am going to have a little bit of a cheeky plug for my own work here, because the story of the Egyptian princess ghost did inspire 2 short stories by me. One is Ghost Train, and I will put the link in the show notes below, and the other was Midnight Screams at Holborn, which you can either find in my Black Dog and Other Gothic Tales collection, or you can check the link in the show notes and you can actually hear me read it, because I think I did it last year as a Christmas ghost story. So we're going to go on from this legend of Egyptian princess ghosts to plague pit stations, because you cannot move in London folklore without coming across plague pits. I mean, honestly, if you look at where's supposed to be a plague pit, I'm surprised there's any actual buildings. And Bank, Liverpool Street and Allgate stations were all supposed to have been built on plague pits. And like I say, it's almost a given at this point that most parts of London will claim them. And it's almost a classification of folklore on its own by this point. But in the case of Liverpool Street Station, it's not a million miles away from the truth, because Crossrail work near Liverpool Street Station did unearth a mass grave in 2015, and 30 skeletons were believed to have been victims of the Great Plague outbreak of 1665. But how does that explain the ghostly figure that's seen on the tube? Because staff sometimes see a man in white overalls waiting on the eastbound Central Line platform after trains have stopped for the evening. He disappears if anyone tries to approach him. According to some versions of the story, he's actually only ever seen on CCTV, and people on the platforms never actually see him in front of them. Allgate Station was apparently also built on a plague pit, and the station opened in 1876, and soon after staff would hear footsteps in the tunnels that stopped abruptly. But it's weirdly unlikely to be anything malevolent, because an electrician almost died after he fell onto a live rail. 20,000 volts ran through him, yet he managed to survive. Staff nearby reported seeing an elderly angel, described as a luminous figure of an old lady, kneeling beside the man and stroking his hair. So is she the ghost of Allgate Station? Because if so, then she actually sounds like she's probably quite a nice figure to have around. We have obviously also discussed the Black Nun of Threadneedle Street, who allegedly haunts Bank Station, so I'm not going to dwell on that here, but the link is in the show notes if you want to hear that episode as well. Now obviously it's not just the stations that have anything to do with plague pits, often it's the lines themselves, and there are legends of tube lines having to go around plague pits rather than through them. This indeed is often used to explain why there's such a weird curve in the Piccadilly line near Hyde Park, because it supposedly goes around a plague pit rather than through it. And let's be honest, any empty patch of ground is often considered to have been a plague pit, and the construction of the Victoria line was also considered to have encountered a plague pit. That said, Scott Wood noted that there was no archival reference to the digging of the Victoria line actually disturbing any dead bodies. There has been some work done to actually pinpoint where mass graves actually are on maps, and also you should point out that before the 1665 outbreak, plague victims were actually buried in churchyards or in the grounds of the nearest pest house, which was just a hospital specifically to isolate plague victims from the rest of the community, so you only really find the mass graves from 1665 onwards. Now, because of their depth, the underground tube stations seem to provide an ideal form of shelter during air raids. Now, the authorities weren't actually happy about this and tried many times to stop people from using the stations as air raid shelters, but by 1943 they'd had no choice but to open the stations for that use. And on March 3rd, 1943, 500 people were already inside Bethnal Green Station. Over 1,500 people were outside, standing on the wet steps leading down into the station, ready to be admitted. Unfortunately, at almost 9 p.m, an anti-aircraft battery fired 60 rockets, and the explosions caused a mass panic. 173 people died in the ensuing stampede and crush, including 27 men, 84 women and 62 children. This made it one of the worst civilian disasters of the Second World War. But it does appear that that kind of disaster has also left an imprint on the area, because in 1981, a worker was getting ready to close the station for the night. The trains had stopped running, and he was the last member of staff left. While finishing the last of his paperwork, he heard children sobbing. Thinking he was just overtired, he kept working, but the sound grew louder. Female screams were added to the crying, along with sounds he described as being like those of a panicked crowd. These disembodied sounds lasted for almost 15 minutes, by which point he bolted from his office and left the station. Other members have apparently heard something similar at night, It does make people think that they're hearing a replay of this incredibly sad event. Likewise, a recurring haunting also happens on the 4th of December every year at Lewisham Station. A crash here in 1957 killed 90 people and over 100 more were injured. People still hear their desperate cries on the anniversary. Now we're going to move off somewhere slightly different for a different type of story, and this is the Kennington Loop and the mysterious passenger. Now the Kennington Loop is a section of tunnel at Kennington Station. And basically what happens is the passengers leave the train when it terminates at Kennington, and then drivers take the train through the loop to send them back up the line in the other direction. Now in the 1980s, a driver and guard were stopped in the loop at a red light. They heard the doors connecting the carriages open and shut as if someone was making their way along the train. Worried that a passenger may have been left on the train, they went off to investigate, but the train was empty. They mentioned it to their colleagues, only find out that they weren't the first to experience this. And they actually pinpointed the start of the activity to a tragic death on the line. A man had tried to move between carriages while the train was moving, but he fell onto the tracks instead. That said, that's not the only death in the area. A 21-year-old labourer was electrocuted at the station in September 1926. Could it be Frederick Norman disturbing the trains? And a similar haunting seems to happen at Elephant and Castle Station, where a girl walks the length of the last train of service. She vanishes by the time she reaches the driver's cab. No one knows who she is or indeed what she's looking for. And we're going to end this episode because we have had a look at quite a lot of ghosts, so I thought it might be quite nice to actually have an urban legend instead. And because let's be honest, in a lot of cases urban legends are sort of the folklore that most of us come into contact with, I think. And the legend of the corpse on the tube would appear to date to 2007 on an internet forum. And according to this story, a female art student was heading home late at night. She was alone in the tube carriage but for a man in his 30s. The train stopped at a station and 3 more people got on, and this was 2 men flanking a woman who appeared to be unconscious. The student decided to ignore them until the other man sat next to her. He chatted on as if they were old friends, only pausing to whisper that she should get off at the next stop. She didn't really fancy staying on the train with the 3 newcomers when the man left the train, so she got off the train with him at the next station. Once the train had pulled out of the platform, the man told her that the unconscious woman was actually dead and that he'd seen a pair of scissors sticking out of the back of her skull, and indeed the 2 men had dragged her onto the tube as a result. So is this true? Well, it's highly unlikely because, for one thing, why would 2 men carry a dead woman around on the tube with the actual murder weapon still sticking out of her head? You would think someone might notice. And for another thing, the story has also been repeated in other cities, including Sydney in Australia. Scott Wood notes that versions of the story date back to the 1980s, taking place on intercity trains as well as on the London Underground, but for some reason the Underground one seems to stick, and it's possibly because of the fact that if you were going to choose anywhere in London to know that no one was going to pay you any attention, it would be the Underground. And I think that there is something bizarre enough about the Underground that this kind of urban legend doesn't surprise us in the slightest. And this is the thing, there is something really weird about travelling underground. It's easy to lose your bearings as to where you are, and the seeming miles of tunnels that link the lines belies how close the stations can actually be at surface level. So for example, if you wanted to go from Piccadilly Circus to Leicester Square, it can be a bit of a pain trying to change lines, or you can just leave the station and literally walk between them, and it's about a 2-minute walk. It's so much quicker. But being in such a weird place can tickle that little voice at the back of your brain that wonders what else is down there with you. Indeed, the film Quatermass and the Pit explored this very idea in 1967, when in the film a new tube extension uncovers something that was supposed to remain buried. And obviously the film Creep answered the question about who or what shares the platforms with you late at night. Now, the London Underground is what Mark Auger refers to as a non-place, because it's somewhere transitory that we pass through to get from A to B. While for the time that we're down there, we're temporarily taken out of the ordinary world and placed in a liminal world where the journey is all that matters. You're not at your starting point, nor are you at your destination. You're entirely in the in-between. And you might not be there alone. So what I want to know is, have you had any weird experiences on the tube yourself? I would imagine that many people have, because it is the tube. If you have had any of those experiences, or indeed if you recognise some of these story types but know them from the city that you live in, and there's something similar on your underground system, again, please do feel free to leave a comment. If you're listening to this on YouTube, just pop it in the comments below. If you're listening to it on your podcast app of choice, you can visit the blog post that this episode is for, and you can then add a comment to that as well. And it would be really interesting to see how far and wide some of these story types do actually go, because I do know that the Corpse on the Tube one is a really, really widespread story, and quite a lot of places do lay claim to that one. So it'd be quite interesting to see if any of the other ones have as well. I think the Bethnal Green one probably hasn't, because it's such a specific one and it's such a sad story as well. But I would be keen to know about any of the other ones. If you are interested in folklore and legends and whatnot around trains and railways in particular, then I do have a bonus episode on that as well, and you can gain access to that if you become a Patreon supporter at the £3.50 a month tier or higher. And there are something like 24 bonus episodes now, so you will get quite a bang for your buck if you do decide to sign up as a supporter, because you get access to the backlog as well as everything that I create in future. So we are going to have a look at the folklore of seafaring next week, so that should be quite interesting. I'm expecting more superstitions and so on for that one, so that should be really cool. And then I haven't decided on the final one yet, so if you have got anything specific or any types of transport that you specifically want to hear about, please do drop me a message and let me know. And that would be really cool, because I'd like to do something that I know people have asked for. But without any further ado, I will let you go now and do whatever it is that you're going to do on this marvellous Saturday, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.